To get some analysis on the latest developments in Ukraine, we want to turn now to Robert B. Charles. He's a former naval intelligence officer and Republican political figure.
And he worked as Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department under Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thank you for joining us tonight. Well, of course, for days, Mr. Putin has been rattling the sabers about his nuclear weapons. And now today, he bombs a nuclear power plant, putting the world more on edge over this particular issue. What do you make of this action today?
Well, it's a more irresponsible act. Obviously, to bomb a nuclear power plant is about as irresponsible as it gets. It's not going to blow up, and they've shut down the 6 reactors. But obviously, what it does is it shuts down a quarter of Ukraine's power. As long as those rods and the reactors are not, the cores have to be exposed for you to get a meltdown. But it also puts the rest of Europe in fear. They remember Chernobyl. So it was obviously an act to kind of improve his negotiating position, but I'm not sure it did that. I have a tendency to think it undermined his credibility yet further. And I guess if you back up 2 steps, you can see that a lot of things are not going right for Mr. Putin here. His supply lines are broken down. He's got a 40-mile convoy that doesn't seem to be moving. The morale in his military is flagging and not looking good. The air power he's supposed to have to create blitzkrieg never materialized, or at least it hasn't materialized yet. And you have this resistance movement that seems to grow every day, and you have the UN, I think 141 out of 193 countries voting against him, 35 abstaining, including China. So at the end of the day, I think whatever he calculated he would get out of this is going to be a heavy slog, and I think he's going to lose more than he gains. But certainly bombing a nuclear reactor, nuclear power plant, even though the reactors are shut down now and encased, that was about as high a level of irresponsibility as you can get.
Could it be that he could be even more dangerous while he's in this state of decline, I guess, in Ukraine? Things are not going his way, as you said. So what are his options if he's trying to get out of this mess? He can't really walk back from this, can he? Because that would be a political humiliation. What are his options short of moving forward and making a bad situation even worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have 3 potential options. One is that he doesn't get what he wants, but at some point he pulls chalks and declares victory and says that's what he wanted. The second is he stays for the long haul, and it's a big, long slog, and it becomes worse and worse in many ways, I think, politically for him. Opposition at home grows. The morale of the army might even turn the army. So you just don't know. At some point, a series of failures, one upon another, could really backfire on him. Or you could get to some sort of the 1% where he does something radical, like tries to use a tactical nuclear weapon. But I really don't think that's in his calculus. I think that he wants Ukraine. He has, for sort of messianic reasons, the notion that he's going to rebuild the Soviet Union, and it starts there. I don't think he's going to attack a NATO country. He's not equipped for that fight. But at the same time, I think he's going to do everything he can, and he's going to declare victory. And even though it looks messy and it may not be victory, he's going to put it in those terms. I don't think that puts the resistance out of business, just like the French resistance in World War II. I think they just stay at it. So I think he's in a bit of a mess.
So knowing that NATO is not going to invoke a no-fly zone, knowing that NATO is not going to put any troops on the ground, does that give him an advantage in how this moves along day to day, week to week?
Well, so the rules of the road, at least, I mean, he's violated a number of the legal rules of the road. We don't just walk in and take contiguous countries because we think we deserve them. But in reality, there are some rules of the road. One is that we, NATO countries, will provide defensive weapons to a country like Ukraine, or Taiwan for that matter, and we have done so, and we are doing so. And those defensive weapons, Javelin missiles against tanks, Stingers against airframes, can make the invading country very uncomfortable, can slow the process, and might even eventually reverse it if it becomes too costly, particularly on the home front. We're not going to put NATO troops in there, and that's the right answer, because this is not a NATO country. We are bolstering our NATO allies, in particular Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and I think probably some of the other NATO countries with troops, so that they understand, he understands that he doesn't want to touch a NATO country. But I don't think that's his intent. I think this was a miscalculation based on the idea that he thought he could get a quick win in Ukraine. And maybe he has other non-NATO countries in his line of fire, but I think this is slowing him down dramatically. And I think it's proving that this modernized Russian military that we all thought was supposed to be such a grand machine, at least so far, has proved to be a stumbling.
I want to talk about what you just mentioned about the United Nations General Assembly vote and the fact that it was overwhelmingly in favor of condemning Russia and how isolated the country is right now. 35 countries abstained, countries that typically would be having good relations with Russia, including China, India, Cuba. They abstained from the vote. As he becomes more and more isolated in the world stage, what does that mean for him and the future of the conflict in Ukraine?
As a couple quick points, you're absolutely right. China, Cuba, Venezuela abstained. The only countries that voted with him were North Korea, I think,
Syria,
and Syria. You know, not a particularly grand group of allies. I think what it means is he gets more and more diplomatically isolated. I think economic sanctions begin to kick in, and I think they begin to be unified, or we are unified, the rest of the world, in sort of bringing him back to his senses. I think the Russian people, with whom Ronald Reagan always pointed out we have quite a lot in common, become increasingly disaffected, I think, with his leadership. I mean, that's what I would predict. Now, whether that leads to something more than repression on his part, I don't know. But he, you know, my feeling is here that he pulled the lever, or he threw the dice, and he thought that he would come up with high numbers, and actually he's come up with snake eyes, and it's not looking very good for him.
Real quick, we're out of time, but I do want to ask about the oligarchs and the sanctions. Will that really matter? Most people say the oligarchs are also afraid of him, and he would simply throw them in jail were they to come up against him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the sanctions we put in yet are the powerful sanctions we should. I think we should immediately cut off all oil imports from him. We import 600,000 barrels. Why are we doing that from a country that's at war with the rest of the world? And in fact, we're financing that war. I think we should actually encourage all of our NATO allies, in particular the countries that are most dependent on him, to stop importing, and we should provide them with as much oil and LNG as we can. I think we should restart our own production facilities, which it was probably a mistake to turn off. And in the grand scheme of things, this isolation, I think, just becomes more and more obvious. It becomes more and more painful to him, and I think it hurts the Russian people. But the Russian people, in effect, are not in favor of this anyway. So in effect, they also, I think, may in fact favor this kind of a direction to kind of pull back, you know, get him to pull his horns in and pull back. It's a true tragedy. I mean, you know, in the modern world, since World War II, we haven't had as many tragedies as we had, you know, consecutively and simultaneously during World War II. But this is a pretty significant tragedy. I mean, it's creating refugee flows in the millions, and it's bad news. And he needs to sort of come to his senses and pull back.
We're going to try to squeeze in one more question. We know that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, talked with the White House today. The president wants to put together a $10 billion package for more assistance to Ukraine. Stinger missiles are going. The Javelin anti-tank missiles are going there. But the United States is not going to get actively involved. What do you think could be done more by the White House to assist the president of Ukraine, and what they may have discussed today about what the United States can do next?
Well, I'm sure that the president of Ukraine said, give me everything you got, and I need it now. Actually, I need it yesterday. Biden has been slow. I'm glad that he's not trying to put troops into Ukraine. That would not be smart. I'm glad that he's trying to stick with defensive weapons. That's smart. I'm glad that he's not providing air power. That's smart. But, you know, this is a defensive conflict now in terms of Ukraine, and we need, the West at large needs to do a lot more than we've done. The notion of throwing a few things in at the beginning and sort of calling it a day, imagining either that it wasn't going to do any good or that what we'd given was good enough, that was wrong. If we had put in more earlier and it had been crystal clear that a unified NATO was going to really create a seawall for Ukraine in terms of defensive weapons, it could have deterred Putin from initiating this in the first place. At this point, the whole mission has to just be supporting Ukraine and the principles behind it. You know, we're not talking a lot about the principles, and we really ought to be. This is freedom and democracy versus autocracy. And if China, you know, initially encouraged this a little behind the scenes, then it's also against communism. So, you know, the grand scheme of things, we need to be clear here so that China doesn't try to take Taiwan and that Putin doesn't try to do this again and pulls back.
Robert Charles, formerly with the State Department, thank you so much for your analysis tonight.
Sure. Thank you.